while for many hundreds of years we have lived in a world whose problems were territorially bounded and whose responses and answers were territorially bounded. And the fact is, the nation state was both the venue and frame within which problems occurred and the venue and frame in which we solved the problems. But that has changed radically. In the last 50 to 75 years, we have entered an era of interdependence. All of the challenges we face are interdependent. AIDS, HIV, drugs, prostitution, weapons of mass destruction, global immigration, labor markets, capital markets, technology, you name it. The problems we face are interdependent and global, and all the solutions are still wrapped up inside the territory of the nation state. We have states and citizens with borders and problems without borders. And how are we going to deal with that unless we find some form of citizens without borders, some form of democracy without borders? In other words, unless we find a way to democratize globalization or globalize democracy, we're in trouble. That requires a change in our mindset. One of the fundamental changes I see is, up until now, the effort to build global governance has been based on nation states. The G7, the G8, the G20, the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, they all take for granted the sovereign state and say, let's have a collection of sovereign states. But a collection of sovereign states is like a collection of mad dog bulls. States are defined by their sovereignty, by their territory, by their limits, by their autonomy. You can't have a community of autonomous states. That the whole point of autonomy is that you can't be communal. So I think states are poor building blocks. And one reason when we launched the interdependence movement that we looked to cities is that in many ways cities are more networked, more associated with one another, more global than the nation states of which they're a part. In some ways, Jakarta, Paris, Rio de Janeiro, New York, London, Tokyo have more in common with one another than with the different nation states and national cultures they are part of. And a taxi driver can move from Karachi to London to New York to Mexico City and feel pretty much at home in the same way in each one. So the first hint for me is that we have to build a new architecture of global interdependence, not around states, but around cities, around global cities of the kind in which we have held Interdependence Day. The second clue is there has to be a strong bottom-up role for civic organizations and citizens. We need not just non-governmental organizations, but non-governmental organizations without borders. And the third thing is, if you build democracy bottom-up with citizens, then as long as citizens see themselves as territorially bounded, as obedient to a sovereign power, you'll never get global governance. For that, we need citizens without frontiers. We need citizens who conceive themselves and think of themselves as part of a global network. Third thing is we have to use the internet and the new web technology, which overcomes time and space and allows people to associate across territories and across boundaries. And the fourth thing is we need some form of confederalism. There will never be, and should never be, a centralized unitary global government. That's an absurd and dangerous notion. But you can have a confederalized association of global cities and societies and provinces, which together constitute a new form of decentralized confederal government. So those are four hints at how one might move in this direction. Hobbes said a long time ago, covenants without the sword are of no use at all. Contracts that can't be enforced don't mean anything. People talk about international law on and on. As far as I'm concerned, it doesn't exist. Because without an international enforcer, it is meaningless. If international law existed, the Rwanda genocide never would have happened. If international law existed, the Croatian and Serbian conflict never would have happened. If international law existed, Palestine-Israel would be resolved peacefully. There is no international law because there is no international sovereignty, no international enforcement, no international power. So the real key to international law is not the character and the nature and the content of international law, but the absence of enforcement, which is about the absence of pooled sovereignty, the absence of some form of meaningful, effective global governance. So when you ask about the law, that just circles back to the other question, and the question is then, how do we get some form of meaningful, pooled international sovereignty that allows us not just to conceive and promulgate international laws, but enforce them. Absent enforcement, as far as I'm concerned, the law doesn't exist.